Okay, so I have a lot of ideas that I'd like to share with you in the continuation of the Torah classes that we've been giving over the last few weeks since we began the book of Genesis. So we're in the last Parsha of the book of Genesis. It's called Parshat Vayechi. And I'm not going to recap too much of what went on before. We have Joseph, who is the chief viceroy, second in command to the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and he has been the dispenser of food, and he has been the one who gave food to his brothers who came down, not knowing that Joseph, their brother, who they had sold into slavery 22 years earlier, that they had sold him into slavery, not knowing what would happen to him. He ends up becoming the viceroy of Egypt. He ends up being the one who's distributing food to the whole land. Everybody all around is in extreme famine and hunger, and they come to the grand vizier, the second in command to Pharaoh, to get food. And lo and behold, when the brothers come down, Joseph recognizes them. They do not recognize him. He recognizes them, and he puts them through a whole series of events that we've been discussing over the course of the last few weeks, as to bringing them to a place where the dreams that he had about them come true, where he gets them to a place where they have done teshuvah, where they've repented for having sold him into slavery. They are now different people, especially Judah is a different person. He stepped in and tried to defend the only other son of the beloved mother Rachel, Joseph's only other brother Benjamin, that he was going to take in as a slave, and Yehuda steps in and says, no, don't take him, we can't do that to our father, etc. We talked about that last week. This week we get to the end of Jacob's life. He's lived for the last 17 years in the land of Goshen. He came down, we had the reunion of Jacob with his son Joseph, who didn't know what had happened to him for the last 22 years. They reunite, they reconnect. It's an amazing scene. And then Joseph sets them up, all the brothers and all their families, and Jacob, his beloved father, sets them up in this separate little suburb, so to speak, of Egypt, this little area called Goshen, and has been living in Goshen for the last 17 years. Interestingly, 17 years that Jacob has lived in the land of Goshen were considered to be the best years of his life. And 17 years lines up with the 17 years of him raising Joseph. Joseph was 17 when he sent him off to check on his brothers and never saw him again. So for the 17 years with which he was blessed to raise Joseph, he now has 17 years on the other side of where he's now, it said these 17 years where he's living out the rest of his life. So it says at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. This word living, truly living. When are we truly living? When we're engaged, when we're with simcha, when we have joy, when we're passionate, when we're doing meaningful things. And it was said that Jacob was living the perfect life at that point. It was a little bit like heaven, his life at that point. He was living with his children, with his grandchildren. He was studying Torah, having a relationship with God continually. He knew that Jacob was still alive. He knew that Joseph was still alive. He had what is considered to be the best years of his life, 17 years. And at that point, 147 years, he realized it was time to die. So very interestingly, we understand that this is the first time where sickness is ever came into the world. Jacob asks God for sickness. Says, I need to know when I'm going to die. I want to put my affairs in order. I want to bless my children. I want to have a sense that I'm about to die. And so he asks God to give him illness. Very interesting. This is the first time illness shows up in the Torah. And he asks for illness, and he becomes ill, and he's able to set his affairs in order. He's able to bring his children to his bedside. He's able to bless them. He's able to kind of like give over what he wants to give over. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And so he gathers, first of all, he gets Joseph to come to his bedside. So the time approached for, I'm reading right out of the Torah, the time approached for Israel to die. By the way, I want to mention something. It uses his name Israel here. So Israel, Jacob, as you know, when Jacob struggled with the angel renamed him Yisrael. So he has Yisrael and Jacob. God renamed him, So he's Jacob and Yisrael. And these two names of our patriarch are interchangeable. And Jacob is considered the man, that name considered the struggle. It was the name that personified the struggle that is this world, that Jacob was struggling with the divine. He was struggling to manifest the best of himself. Jacob is the name that represents struggle. Yisrael is the name of having overcome. It's a more spiritual name. It's a higher name. It's a more in the higher world kind of name. So who's dying in this death scene? This is the death scene of Jacob, our forefather. Jacob dying, or is Yisrael dying? And obviously we're called the children of Israel, but many of the commentators talk about this being the death of Yisrael, like his soul goes into the next realm, but we're left being the children of Jacob, that we're still struggling. We're still in a world where we have to struggle, where we're kind of working, and it's hard, and there's pain, and there's suffering, and there's illness, and there's all this. That's the Jacob world. Anyway, so Israel, time for Israel to die, so he called his son, he called Joseph, and he says to him, he calls Joseph. Well, it's interesting that he calls Joseph. He doesn't call his other brothers, the other sons. He knows Joseph is the man who can make this happen. Joseph is the most powerful, next to Pharaoh, most powerful man in the world. And he says to him, Jacob says to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, please place your hand under my thigh and do kindness and truth with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt. For I will lie down with my fathers, and you shall transport me out of Egypt and bury me in their tomb. That's in the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, in Israel. He's saying to his son Joseph, I need you to swear, you need to take an oath. You need to promise me that you will take me out from Egypt, and you will bury me with my ancestors, with my father, with my grandfather, and my grandmother, and my mother, with my mother. And you will bury me in the cave of Machpelah, in the cave of the patriarchs. And Pharaoh would not permit, Jacob would assume that Pharaoh would not permit Joseph, who is the Grand Vizier, who is like the high echelons of the government of the whole kingdom of Egypt. He wouldn't let this father go be buried in Israel. It's interesting. I heard a Rabbi Foreman tape, and he said it would be like the Queen, if the Queen of England were to die, and she requests to be buried in Madagascar. Like the whole country would go crazy. You can't bury the Queen in Madagascar, right? She has to be buried in England. So here's the second in command of Pharaoh, and his father is asking, please bury me in Israel. So he has to ask Joseph to swear to him that he'll do it. And Joseph says, I swear to you. And at that point, I read that Joseph is making a choice. He's making a choice to have his father, his biological father, be his priority. Pharaoh took him in, gave him this position of power, and dressed him, and gave him a wife, and gave him a new name, and has adopted him, so to speak, and has given him a lot. But when push comes to shove, when there's now going to be a conflict between Pharaoh and Jacob, Joseph chooses Jacob. So when Jacob says, please swear, please promise me that you will bury me in the land of Israel, then Joseph says he will. And he uses that oath that he made with Jacob as leverage to persuade Pharaoh to allow him to take his father out of Egypt. Pharaoh argues. Pharaoh says, you can't do this. This is not the right thing to do. And at that point, there's a conversation in the Medrash that says that Joseph said to Pharaoh, I hold by my oaths. An oath is a very powerful expression that I commit to doing something. I have to do it. And he says, and I committed to not tell anybody that I know more languages than you, Pharaoh. Pharaoh apparently knew 70 languages. He did not know Hebrew. And Joseph knew Hebrew, and he knew one more language than Pharaoh. And Pharaoh didn't want the people to know. And he took an oath to Pharaoh that he wouldn't tell anybody. So now Pharaoh's coming and saying, I want you to break the oath that you made to your father. And Joseph says, I can't break that oath, because if I break that oath, I have to break my other oath that I made to you, that I wouldn't disclose that I know more languages than you. So, okay, fine. So he uses that as leverage to allow, or to persuade, or to cajole, or whatever the words are, to get Pharaoh to a place where he will agree that there's going to be this mass burial of Jacob in the land of Israel, And it's interesting because we have a lot of conversation in our day about where we get buried. This week's Torah portion, Vayechi, is considered the Torah portion of the Chevra Kadisha. It's the Torah portion of the burial society, because so much of the conversation that occurs in this week's Torah portion is about the illness of Jacob, how he becomes ill and he blesses his children, he puts his and he gets buried, and he asks to be buried, and he asks to be buried in Israel. So nowadays there are people who are transported to Israel for burial. They live in other countries outside of Israel, obviously, and then they die and they want to be transported to Israel. And the conversation is, is that okay? And and is this something we promote? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? So I want to just bring up a few reasons why it was that Jacob wanted to be buried in Israel, and he had a few really good reasons why he wanted to be buried in Israel. And obviously, at the end of the day, he is. And I can't find my notes, but I'll just tell you what they are. So, firstly, Jacob had a prophecy, and he knew that, as we know, we're going to have the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues are going to manifest themselves in the land of Egypt. One of the plagues that happened in the land of Egypt is the plague of lice. And the plague of lice not only affects the people and their belongings and their physical selves, but it also gets into the ground, and it goes into the land, and it goes into the earth. And Jacob didn't want to be buried in an earth where the lice would be everywhere. So that was one reason why he didn't want to be buried in the land of Egypt, because of the forthcoming plague that he prophesied that there will be lice. The second reason is that there's a teaching, mystical teaching, that the people who are buried in Israel at the time of the resurrection of the dead, which is a time that will come at the end of days, where our bodies and souls will be resurrected, where there'll be a recoupling of our body and soul, that the first to rise up will be those who are buried in Israel. So he wanted to be part of that, so he wanted to be buried there. Another reason is that at that time of the resurrection of the dead, when the soul and body will come back together, that it will all happen in Israel. And so anybody who is buried anywhere outside of Israel, there'll be tunnels. I mean, I don't really know how to understand this. I'm just teaching it to you. I've heard it over and over again in many different sources, that there will be tunnels. And the people who are buried outside of Israel will roll through the tunnels and get to Israel. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be in the place. He didn't want to have to roll through the tunnels. And so knowing that that was going to be something that was happening in the future, he wanted to be buried in the land of Israel. And the final reason that I found given as to why he wanted to be buried in Israel is because he didn't want the Egyptians to worship his grave. He didn't want to become idolized by the Egyptians. He didn't want them to, because he's the father of Joseph, and because of all the good that they had done by being who they were, and knowing that he was a holy person, etc., that his grave could potentially become a place of pilgrimage for the Egyptians. He didn't want that. He didn't want that to happen. He was fearful of that, so he didn't want to be buried in Egypt. And finally, he didn't want the Jewish people to consider Egypt home. Like, if he was buried there, then there could be like our patriarch Jacob is buried in the land of Egypt, so it becomes a place that we identify with, and he didn't want that to happen. No, I have to be buried in Israel because that's the land, that's the Jewish land, that's where the Jewish people have to go, that's where our homeland, so we're going to bury our patriarchs and matriarchs in that land. So those are many given reasons why he wants to be buried there. So in many different synagogues around the world, this week's Torah portion is given over to discuss burial, to discuss what it is, and I've talked about it a number of times. I want to mention one thing, though, that I think is very interesting. The transportation that now entails to get somebody who dies outside of Israel to be buried in Israel, right? So we have to arrange for an aeroplane, they have to be flown. It's very expensive to be flown to Israel for burial. And so one of the conversations that people have is how to use your money. Is that a good use of the money to fly people to Israel, or should that money be used in other ways? Just as something I'm very involved in and very I spent a lot of time thinking about is the cremation rate in America. One of the reasons given why American Jewry is choosing to cremate themselves is because it's so expensive to have a Jewish burial. So if we took all the money that we're using to fly people to Israel and we use that, I don't know, if we use that to help pay for people's burials, like how amazing would that be? I have a friend actually who lives in Denver, and she was involved with a Jewish woman that had been on an Israel trip with her who was very sick, and was planning to, she was in hospice. She's in hospice right now. And she put up on a few WhatsApp groups, could people please contribute money? Because one of the main reasons why she was choosing to be cremated was because she didn't have the money for a burial. And so literally within 10 hours on these few WhatsApp groups, she had raised enough money to have a kosher burial. And so she was going to get that kosher. In fact, I think she over collected the money, and she was going to use the extra money to help other people where money is a reason why they're choosing to be cremated and not to be buried. So Jacob, our patriarch, and at the end of this week's Torah portion, Joseph also dies. Both of them want to be buried in Israel. They both request, Jacob requests of Joseph, knowing Joseph's the one that can pull this off, and Joseph asks his brothers to be the ones to be responsible for making sure that his bones leave Egypt when the children of Israel, when we, the Jewish people, come out during the Exodus. That one of the things that Moses is very concerned with on the night of the whole Exodus from Egypt. Where's Moses? Moses is going to get the coffin of Joseph, which is sunken into the river Nile, and he goes and he gets the coffin, the metal coffin that houses the bones of Joseph, and he makes sure that they exit with the Jewish people as they come out of Egypt during the Exodus, during the Passover story where the Jewish people are coming out of Egypt, bringing with them the bones of Joseph. Okay, so this week's Torah portion, we have Jacob asking to be ill so that he can put his affairs in order. We have Jacob requesting to be buried in the land of Israel. And before he dies, having the sickness, knowing he's going to die, he starts to put his affairs in order. And one of the things he does is he starts to bless his children. What an amazing thing it is to bless people. We have this amazing capacity built into the universe where blessing, which is a berecha, which is a pool, an overflow of expansiveness and goodness and love that can come into the world. And when Jacob brings Joseph in to tell him to please and make an oath and please bury me in Israel, he says, I want to bless you, and I want to bless your children. And he says, behold, your father is ill. And he takes his two sons, Joseph takes his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he goes to Joseph takes his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they go to Jacob, who's in Goshen, and Jacob says to Joseph that I'm about to die, and these two sons, please bring them close to me. And so Israel's eyes were heavy with age; he could not see. So he brought them, the two children, near him, and he kissed them and he hugged them. And Israel said to Joseph, I dared not accept the thought that I would see your face, and here God has shown me even your children. So Jacob had so much fear and not knowing for 22 years where Joseph was, all those years where he was sold and went down to Egypt, all those years he had no knowledge exactly of what happened to Joseph. Was he really killed? Was he really devoured by the animals? Is he really dead? He always gave up hope. He was always in a semi-state of mourning, we understand. And now, not only did I get to see you, I never even prayed that I could see you, my dear, dear son Joseph, but I even get to see your children. And Joseph removed Ephraim and Manasseh from his knees, and he prostrated himself with his face towards the ground. And he took the two of them. He took Ephraim with his right hand to Israel's left, and he took Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and he drew close to him. I don't know if that made any sense to you. Joseph brings his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So I just want to paint this picture. This is the first time in the Torah where we have this very beautiful, intimate coming together of a grandparent with a grandchild, with grandchildren. And Jacob, the grandfather, is going to bless his grandchildren, and he elevates them to the status of a tribe, of a child, as if they're the same level as his children. They're the same level as his children, and he blesses them as if they're one of his children. So, as you know, we have a tradition of the firstborn, and the firstborn has more rights to things and has a greater birthright, etc., etc. Firstborn. The firstborn of Joseph is Manasseh. So Joseph, knowing that Manasseh is the firstborn, puts Manasseh under Jacob's right hand, because that's the hand that's going to give the greater blessing, should go to the firstborn. So he puts his firstborn Manasseh under Jacob's right hand. He takes his secondborn, not Manasseh, Ephraim, the secondborn, puts under Jacob's left hand, right? So he can bless his two grandchildren. The older grandchild, Manasseh, is under his right hand, and his younger grandson, Ephraim, is under his left hand. Jacob knows that the birthright, that the firstborn blessing will go to Ephraim. So he doesn't switch the brothers. He doesn't do that. And one of the commentators suggests the reason he doesn't do that is it would be very embarrassing to Manasseh if he were to switch the brothers, right? Like, oh, sorry, you're supposed to be here and you're supposed to be here, and he moves them around. Like, that would be like, no, but Manasseh should get the first bracha, etc., etc. So what does Jacob, our forefather, do? And this might be something you've seen pictures of or you're aware of, but he crosses his hands. So his right hand goes to Ephraim and his left hand goes to Manasseh. So he blesses his grandsons with his hands crossed. So his right hand with the greater firstborn blessing goes to the secondborn, goes to Ephraim, and his left hand onto Manasseh. So we don't hear anywhere, not in any of the sources, any arguments between these two brothers. We've had a Genesis filled with sibling rivalry. We've had every single person in our Torah, every single parsha, in our Torah up until now has had sibling rivalry, right? We've had, and even in the previous generation with Joseph and his brothers, or with Jacob and Esau, etc., etc. Keep going back. We had sibling rivalry all the way back to Cain and Abel. Right, where Cain and Abel can't even, like, after Adam and Eve become Cain and Abel, and we have the first murder between brothers. So all the way through this week's through Genesis, we've had sibling rivalry. This is the first time where Ephraim and Manasseh are brothers, and you don't hear a peep about them. There's silence. There's only silence. They accept everything the way it is. It's no problem. If Manasseh gets the second blessing and Ephraim gets the first blessing, they're not arguing with each other. They're at peace. They're at peace. They exhibit the quintessential goal of sibling harmony. And so it's really fantastic. And one of the things that we do today on Friday night, there's a tradition to bless our children. And we bless our boy children that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, which is so interesting, because we bless the girls that they should be like Sarah, Rachel, and Leah and Rebecca, right? We bless them; they should be like the matriarchs. But we bless the boys; they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, because Ephraim and Manasseh, a few reasons. One of them is because Ephraim and Manasseh are the first brothers in our Torah narrative where they don't argue. There's no sibling rivalry at all. Okay, another reason why we bless them like Ephraim and Manasseh, because we want our children should not fight with each other and should not be jealous of each other and should not harm each other and should live in harmony with each other like Ephraim and Manasseh. So that's one reason. Another reason given is that in their lives, Ephraim and Manasseh played out and had different energies and different gifts. Manasseh was the son who worked with his father Joseph. He was like the chief of staff. He was like somebody who helped his father distribute the wealth and be in a position of power and physically and materially very engaged in the world. That was the role of Manasseh. And the role of Ephraim was to sit at the feet, or sit in the environment of his grandfather Jacob and learn Torah, whatever they knew at that time, learn about God. Ephraim was the more spiritually attuned son, and Manasseh was the more physical son. And we see this a lot in the Torah, where there's somebody who has the gift of being more physical. Esau was more physical and Jacob was more spiritual. And we see it again in Ephraim and Manasseh. So Ephraim is the more spiritual. He's learning Torah with his grandfather Jacob, and Manasseh is the more physical, and he's working in the higher governmental areas of Egypt with his father Joseph. So when we bless our sons that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, the message that we're thinking about perhaps is that yes, we are all a composite of physical and spiritual. We all have skills that are physical, and some of us are more physical than others, and some of us are more spiritual than others, etc., etc. You get the point. And but at the end of the day, spirituality has to be something that we consider to be a priority, right? We have to have spirituality in our lives as Jews, as people who are connected not only to each other and to the whole universe, but mostly to God. In order to have a relationship to God, we have to have a sense of our spiritual side, of our soul side, of our essence of who we are, like that side of ourselves takes priority. So therefore the Ephraims, who are the one who was learning with Jacob, who was learning Torah, he's the one that we put first. So we bless our children on Friday night. They should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, even though Manasseh was the firstborn, right? So again, one reason is there's no sibling rivalry. Another reason is because what we're saying is that the priority that we want for our children's life is that they should have a well-developed and a sophisticated spiritual life, right? Yes, of course, we want everybody to be comfortable materially, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, our priority is our sense of shalom, a sense of peace, which comes from a spiritually attuned and sensitive and defined and honed spiritual life. So when we pray for our children to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, we put Ephraim first because that's the priority. The priority is our spiritual life. Okay. So actually, it speaks a lot actually about Jacob. When I was saying at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, when it says Jacob lived in the land of Egypt, and these were like the best years of his life. These 17 years of living in Egypt were like the best years. Why? Because he was learning Torah with his grandson. Wow, how amazing is that? And he was surrounded by his children and his grandchildren, and this sense of family. This is the last parsha. Actually, this week's Torah portion, if you actually looked at it in a Torah scroll, it's completely enclosed. It's called a closed parsha, meaning that the last one that ended, there's no gap between last week's Torah portion, which was Vayigash, and next week's Torah portion. There's no spaces between them. It's completely enclosed. It goes straight from the previous one and straight into the next one. So it's a closed parsha. So what's happening in this week's parsha? We have the loss of Jacob. We have the death of Jacob. We have the death of Joseph. And we have the beginning of the enslavement. So we're losing the sense of the family that we've been following through all of Genesis, right? We went from Abraham, when we started back at Abraham, and we came through Isaac, and we came through Jacob, and we come through Joseph, and now we're coming into the nation that's going to be enslaved by the Egyptians. So we're moving. This is the last Torah portion of Genesis. The next Torah portion is in the book of of Exodus. So this is the end. We're moving from family to nation, and the family, the end of the story, so to speak, of the family is one of reconciliation, reunification, and peace. So where these two boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, represent the epitome, they represent the goal of our lives, to live in peace, to not be jealous, to not be envious, to not have hatred in our heart for each other, to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, who were able to celebrate each other, able to to enjoy each other, to allow each other to manifest their own strengths in the world, and to live peacefully, and to not be jealous, and to not embarrass each other, etc., etc. So they did that in a way that is a role model for us, Ephraim and Manasseh. So let's go to the blessing that Jacob blesses them with, and he says to them. So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you shall Israel bless, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh." Where's the blessing? Sorry, where's the blessing? Oh, sorry, I want to give you the blessing. Here it is. So he blessed them, and he said, "O God, before whom my forefather Abraham and Isaac walked, God who shepherds me from my inception until this day. May the angel who redeems me from all evil bless the lads, and may my name be declared upon them, and the name of my forefathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they proliferate abundantly like fish within the land. So this is a blessing that many people bless their children at night before they go to sleep. And it starts with Hamalach. And then some people sing it. Hamalach HaGoel Oti Mikol Ra Yevarech Et Hanarim Vayekare Osai Avraham V'Yitzchak V'Yadgu La'Rov Ba'Kerev Ha'aretz. May the angel who redeems me from all evil bless the lads from my inception until this day. Bless the lads, and may my name be declared upon them, and the names of my forefathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they be proliferate abundantly like fish within the land. It's so interesting, such an interesting. First of all, we don't want any evil, and why are they like fish within the land? I just want to concentrate a little bit on the blessing that Jacob gives his grandchildren, is that they should be like fish within the land. Fish live under the water. Fish are not exposed to the outside world. So if you're walking along a stream, you don't usually see the fish unless you look and you peer in. And so one of the reasons given why Jacob blesses these boys that they should be like fish, and we bless our children that they should be like fish, is because it's under the water where we are impervious to the ayin hara, to the evil eye. That there's a concept of an evil eye, that if somebody wishes you badly, or somebody's jealous of you, or someone hates you, that if you're incumbent and dependent upon somebody else's opinion of you for your own self-worth, that they can have an effect on you. So that's a lot of things I just said there. But the idea is that if I'm dependent on what somebody else thinks of me, and then if they are jealous of me or they hate me or something, then it's going to have more an effect on me than if I'm able to stand independent, if I'm allowed to be myself, if I'm true to myself. I had a really nice saying that I wanted to write here. So hatred and jealousy poisons the spiritual atmosphere, and we give it power if we look for others' approval. If we live by our own inner light, if our inner resources are strong, if we don't need other people's approval, then their emotions and jealousies can't touch us. So that's the concept of the fish under the water. Like, we're impervious to the evil eye. Why? Because the fish is in water, and water is often, I don't know if it's always, likened unto Torah wisdom, unto a relationship to our Torah, which is God, which is the word of God. So if I'm connected to Torah, I'm connected to water, and I'm immersed in water, then the evil eye can't penetrate me. So if I'm like a fish in water, if I'm like a person immersed in Torah wisdom, in truth, then I'm impervious to this evil eye. That's a good thought, right? But it says, but abundantly like fish within the land. So what's that? Shouldn't I be a fish in the water? I'd much rather be a fish in the water than a fish on land. So the idea is that we Jewish people take water with us. We take Torah, which is water, with us. So we bring it with us into the land, into our lives, into the outside world. Ephraim and Manasseh lived with Joseph, who taught them they were Jewish and taught them how to stay Jewish and what it meant to be Jewish. Yet they lived in Egypt. They lived in this land where there were other values and there were other people doing other things, and they were able to be not only, yes, they lived in Goshen, it was a little bit separate, but Joseph himself and his sons who lived with him in wherever they lived, a very fancy place, I'm sure, did not live in Goshen. Joseph did not live in Goshen, very important. His sons lived with him wherever he lived. And so his sons lived like fish with water, but in the land. And that's our prayer for our children, that we all live in the world, and we're part of the world, and we can exist in the world, but we have water. We are surrounded by our little bubble of water that makes us impervious to the Ayin Hara, makes us impervious to what's outside. And it's interesting because I'm now beginning to think what's happening in the world today with anti-Semitism and the attacks and the rally that was just in New York, 25,000 people marching over, or rallying and supporting each other. Today is be proud of being Jewish Day. Like yes, but we're in a land which is not our land. It's not Israel. We're outside of Israel, where we have to be careful, and we have to not hide ourselves. We want to be fish on the land, but we also need the bubble. We need the water. We need to know who we are. We need to know who we are. We need to have inner resources that are strong. We need to have our own inner light that we're following. If we're always looking outside for approval from the outside, then we're going to lose touch of who we are on the inside, and we're not going to fulfill the blessing that we give our children, or we give ourselves, or we give each other, that we should proliferate abundantly like fish within the land. So yes, let's live in the land, or maybe we should all move to Israel. That's a conversation. But when we are in a land that's not ours, and we are like fish, so we're abundant, and we're able to procreate, and we're able to live freely, that we also have a water. We also have our own water that surrounds us, that keeps us alive and sustains us and keeps us solid and keeps us away from the poison of hatred and jealousy that could be directed towards us. And that's what this blessing is suggesting. One of the things that this blessing is suggesting. So when we say this to our children, or we say it to each other, what we're saying is, stay strong, be in touch with who you are. We had a conversation last night at a book group I had about many Jewish people not always necessarily being able to know who they are as Jews. Like, I don't really know what that means. So we have to be good at Jewish education. We have to educate ourselves what it means to be Jewish, and what Jewish values are, and what it means to be connected to God through the Jewish tradition, etc. So there's a lot to think about there. But this is the blessing that is traditionally given to children at night, and we bless our children Friday night that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. So why are we blessing our children on Friday night? I'd just like to address that for 1 second. I'm sure I'm going to run out of time. But I want to address the issue as why do we bless people on Friday night? What's the idea of a blessing? So the idea of a blessing is this abundance, this overflow of a berecha, of a spring, of a body of water that overflows. It just overflows. When I feel full, I can overflow. So Jacob is dying, and he's blessing his children. He's saying to his children, and he goes through every single one of his children, and he blesses every single one of them. All 12 of his children are blessed in this week's Torah portion. And he blesses them, and some of the blessings don't sound like blessings, but if you look at them closely, what they are is they are him, the father, who knows his children so well, feeding back to his children, here is who you are. Here are your strengths. Here are your weaknesses. Here's where you mess up. Here's where you succeeded. I, your father, who love you, and I know you, and I get you. Hopefully parents are like that. Not all parents are like that, but if they are, then when I bless you, I'm giving you a very specific blessing. I'm giving you a blessing that is tailor-made for you, each one of you. And the one that's going to go to Ephraim is a different blessing that's going to go to Manasseh. Different people. The blessing that I get is going to be different than the blessing my brother gets, etc., etc. So again, it takes away from the notion of jealousy, right? If I'm good at things that somebody else isn't good at, they're good at things that I'm not good at. So really, the blessing is that we should all be able to actualize the gifts and the tools and the strengths and the talents and all of those things for good. We should be able to actualize those to the best of our potential. That's our blessings to each one of us. And when we bless each other, like, I don't know, sometimes we have to shut our eyes, like, I'm in front of this person and I'm thinking about this person, and what do I want for you? What do I know about you? It's a much more powerful blessing if I know you and I understand you, and I understand the things that are going on in your life, the struggles that are going on, so I can bless you that this is what you get, or this is what happens to you, and so this idea that we can bless each other is very, very powerful, and that we are able to draw down by our blessings, almost like drawing down the heavenly flow, drawing down the water, drawing down the berecha, the spring water that comes down from the heavens. When I bless you, I want that water to come down and overflow onto you. That's the blessing. And I can do that when I'm happy, when I'm fulfilled, when I'm good and good. And Jacob, it says, until he saw his son Joseph again, had lost his sense of prophecy because he was so mourning his son, and he was unable to be the full Jacob that he was. When he saw his son again, he says, now I can live again. Now I'm happy. Now I'm filled with simcha. Now I can bless my children. I can bless people. I can live more fully because I am with simcha. So on Shabbat, it's all linking back to Shabbat. So on Shabbat, the idea is we get more of a soul, we get an extra soul. Some of the soul that's hovering over our bodies comes into our soul, however you understand that. But there's an idea that we are more soulful on Shabbat. In the bubble of time, there's 25 hours that starts 1 hour before sunset and ends at sunset, Friday afternoon, Saturday night. We have this bubble of time where we are more soulful. Again, maybe we get an extra soul, maybe there's more of our soul that hovers over us, that descends into our bodies, but we become more elevated on Shabbat. And in that elevated state, we want to give the blessing. And hopefully we have peace in our home, and hopefully all of those things. And then we can bless more fully. Our blessing has more power. So that is the reason given as to why we bless our children on Friday night. And you can bless your children anytime, but traditionally it's done on Friday night when you have more soul and you have more joy, and it's spiritual joy. So those combined give you the greater power to bless. So I think that's pretty cool. So talking about peace in our home, and talking about this blessing that he gives all of his children. And then he dies. At the end of giving all his blessing, he dies. He blesses each one of his children. Each one he blesses them. Get to all the end of the blessings, and then he says, "I shall be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the fields of Machpelah, which faces Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as a burial estate." And there they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah, purchase of the field, and the cave within it was from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob finished instructing his sons, he drew his feet into his bed. He expired, and he was gathered to his people. Death is the separation of the soul from its body. The soul starts to separate out from its body. It's hovering over its body until burial. And Joseph fell on his face, and he wept over him, and he kissed him, and everybody's weeping. Now we enter into the mourning phase. So in our tradition today, this place when the soul exits the body, the mourners are mourning, but the mourners are tasked with burying their loved one. So they, in our Jewish law, are exempt from any Torah, anything else. They don't have to do anything else but take care of burying their loved one. That's their major focus. They don't have to go to synagogue and pray. They don't have to do anything. They don't make blessings. Like they just take care of burying their dead, because we want to expedite the process. This soul is hovering over the body that it was coupled with for however many years. Jacob was 100 and I think he was 147. He was 147. So for 147 years, this soul and body were in intimate relationship with each other, and the soul has a spirituality, a holiness, which it gives over to the body. The body becomes holy by its relationship to the soul that has been encased, that it has encased for all of these years. So we, the Jewish people, are very careful with our bodies, right? We're not allowed to tattoo our bodies, we're not allowed to cut our bodies, we're not allowed to kill ourselves. There's a lot of laws in Jewish law today about how we're supposed to take care of our body, because our body is the vehicle that carries the soul through the world. The soul can't live in this world without a body, and the body can't be animated and alive without the soul. So the soul and the body need each other. and they influence each other and they fuse each other. So at the point of death, where the soul rises up out of the body, it doesn't leave right away. It stays. It's watching. It's making sure that the body is taken care of. That it's not left. At the side of the road. God forbid somebody should die at the side of the road and just be left at the side of the road. It's not left at the side of the road. We have a tradition to sit shmira, which means to guard the body, like from the time of the soul beginning its separation from the body until burial, that there's somebody that keeps company, not just to prevent wild animals and anybody stealing things from the dead person, but to bear witness to what's happening and to keep the company of the soul that is still watching out for its body. And we on the Chevra Kadisha are tasked with taking care of this body-soul coupling and helping the transition to burial. So what do? We wash the body. We take extreme care to make sure that it's done in a dignified way. We say prayers that are so beautiful. They come from Song of Songs, and they're love songs that we say. I've actually started reading them out loud in the Tahara room, in the room where we clean bodies. I've actually started saying them out loud because there's such beautiful sayings about how beautiful the body is, and maybe sometime I can read them to you, but they are like in the soul is listening. It doesn't have ears, right? It doesn't have ears anymore, but it hears and it knows. Near-death experiences that people, when they come back after they've died and they say, I saw everything from above, that fits in with our tradition, right? I saw the doctors and I saw this and I saw that, and on top of that chest of drawers there's a shoe, and then like, how would they know that? Because they're hovering, they're over it. There's amazing stories like that of people who were brought back to life, but they knew what was going on above them, and they were declared dead at the scene of an accident or whatever. So we take care. We wash and we dress the body. We dress the body in shrouds. They're cotton white shrouds, and they're the same clothing that the high priest wears on Yom Kippur, on the most holy day in Jerusalem, in the Holy Temple. When he would go into the Holy of Holies, he would wear white garments, the exact same white garments that we are all buried in if we choose to be buried in the traditional way. We get buried in the same garments. So when we come before God at the end of our days on earth, we're dressed appropriately. We're dressed like the high priest on Yom Kippur in the Holy Temple, complete white cotton shrouds. I heard a story about this woman who wanted her father buried in his best suit, and so somebody from the Chevra Kadisha asked her, why does your father want to be buried in the suit? She said, well, he was such a natty dresser, like he really loved his clothes and he always was dressed for the occasion. So the person said, well, what did he wear when he went swimming? So she said, well, he had the most expensive swim trunks. He was the most expensively dressed guy at the beach. All right, so what did he wear when he went out for dinner? He went through all these different scenarios. So he says, well, wouldn't want your father to be buried in the exact best way to be buried. Like, you're dressing your father for every occasion. When he goes to the beach, he dresses like this. When he goes out for dinner, he goes like this. When he's buried, he should be dressed like this. This is the best way to be dressed when you're dead and buried. This is the best way. So it kind of won the argument, I understand, in that story, and she agreed not to have him dressed in a suit, that he was dressed in these plain white shrouds. But what's interesting about the plain white shrouds is that they came into our tradition in the time of Rabbi Gamliel. So apparently before that, people were dressed in finery and so on, and so they were not an equalizer. Since Rabbi Gamliel, everybody traditionally is buried in these plain white cotton shrouds, which means everybody's the same. Everybody gets the same burial, right? We get put in the same clothing. Whether you're rich or poor, you get the same clothing. Now we can change that. We can shift that, and we can say, oh, you can be buried in a very expensive mahogany coffin, or you can be buried in a plain pine box. Does it really matter, right? So it depends what you believe about that. But from traditional standpoint, plain pine box, and in Israel there are no coffins, right? You get buried straight into the ground. Don't bother with the coffin, because the idea is we're going back into the earth. We have to go back into the earth, just like Jacob wanted to be put back into the earth in Israel. He doesn't want to be in the earth in Egypt. He wants to be one with the land of Israel and come and so on. So coffins, that's an issue that might be worth having a conversation about. Like, where's the money going there? And then this flying to Israel thing that I mentioned in the beginning. Like, it's very expensive to fly to Israel. And I've told my children many years that I want to be buried in Israel. But now I'm wondering with them how much money it's going to cost. Maybe that's not the right thing to do. I don't know. Anyway, so that's something to think about. Okay, so peace versus truth. In our tradition, we have always this peace versus truth dialectic paradox. Like, what wins? Is truth or peace? Peace or truth? And as I mentioned, Ephraim and Manasseh were the people who lived with great peace between them. And at the end of this week's Torah portion, after all the blessings, after Jacob dies, and after the whole thing, they take him, the whole entourage, they take the whole entourage to Israel to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, in the cave of the patriarchs. And all of Egypt, apparently, is like a huge entourage, go with this funeral procession. By the way, on the way back, Joseph, this is incredible, Joseph on the way back, he doesn't go straight back, he goes back to the pit that his brothers threw him in those 22, however many years ago. They threw him in this pit, if you remember when we talked about it then, and we couldn't see the bottom of the pit. It was, how deep is the pit? And there were no snakes and scorpions, or there were snakes and no, it was empty. There was no water, but there were snakes and scorpions, and he didn't get bitten, and he didn't get killed by the snakes and scorpions, which was considered a miracle. So Joseph is going back to the place where he experienced a miracle and where he survived something that was a miraculous redemption. Like, he should have, if he was a normal person, if God wasn't looking out for him, he could very easily have died in that pit, but he didn't. And so he saw the pit as a place where there was a miracle. And so he goes back to this place to give thanks to God for saving him from a life-threatening situation. The life-threatening situation was being thrown into the pit, and he survived that. So he goes back to thank God and to give and to have gratitude to God for saving him in this life-threatening situation. He goes back to the pit. And the brothers are like, they don't really know what to make of this. Is this him? Like, is now Dad's dead? Now our father Jacob is dead. They are fearful for their lives. They're fearful that Joseph will now enact revenge upon them. That all the things they did to him, the throwing him in the selling him, wanting to kill him, the hatred, etc., that he will now take revenge. And as we know, that he doesn't take revenge. He doesn't take revenge. He says, it's all in God's hands. I know you meant this bad for me, but don't, it was all in God's hands. It was meant to be this way, that I would end up here and I could distribute wealth and I could do everything I could do, and blah, blah, blah. And all the miracles all the dreams could come to fruition, etc. So I see the confluence of my past as God orchestrating the way. Right? And actually, go back to the blessing that we give our children, that we see that God is in that case referred to as a shepherd. There are very few times in the Torah where God is referred to as a shepherd. And when we give this blessing to our children, we say that they should see God as a shepherd. Another time where we use that term shepherd is in the psalm that we say at a funeral. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? Everybody says that. What does it mean? What does it mean that we say that God is our shepherd, that he lies me down fresh water, that his rod and his staff will comfort me? What is that? The judgment and the compassion of God, that the way things unfold, I don't really know because I'm a little person, but God, who is our shepherd, knows. And he's steering the flock, he's steering history, he's steering people, he's steering events, he's steering me and you, like a shepherd steers sheep. And a shepherd only has the well-being of the sheep in mind. The shepherd is there only to take care of the sheep and make sure that they are safe, and make sure that they are in good place, and make sure that they are, okay, maybe we can keep extending the analogy, but God is our shepherd, making sure that our lives go along in a certain direction, and that we meet certain people and we end up this and that and the other. And so this way of understanding God as a shepherd is something that we want to have for ourselves, and something we want to have for our children. So again, this idea of shepherd. So at the end of at the end of this week's Parsha, where Jacob dies and he's given thanks at the pit and he's coming back to continue being the viceroy in Egypt. And the brothers come back and they beseech him. They're worried that Joseph's going to take revenge on them, and so they go to him and they say, please don't. And actually, what they do is they lie. They say to him, Dad said that you shouldn't take out any. You shouldn't be harsh with us, and you shouldn't take revenge on us. There's no commentary that says that's true. And so I think what's really interesting about this is that where these brothers come and they say, Jacob told us that you shouldn't be harsh with us and you shouldn't, punish us. That is that lie? Is that making something up for the sake of peace, right? So they're fearful that Joseph's going to do something violent or harmful, and so for the sake of peace, they make up this story. And there are times in our tradition where we are enjoined to maybe put the truth aside in order to find peace, in order to have a higher value of peace over truth. Is it better to be right, or is it better to be at peace? And the Jewish response is better to be at peace. So traditionally, if you were at a wedding where you didn't think the bride was particularly pretty or beautiful, you are to lie and to say she's beautiful and tell her she's beautiful. Right? What's the point of telling anybody anyway? What do you know? Who are you? You know the truth of what somebody looks like to you. So it's going to harm somebody's sense of self. So in your mind, the truth is this bride isn't pretty, but you want peace and you want to bring out joy and you want to bring out happiness and you want this bride to feel good on her special day. So you don't tell the truth for the sake of peace. Also, at eulogies, back to the death theme. That at eulogies, the idea is not to necessarily say all the truth about the deceased person lying before you, and to build them up and to encourage people to cry. We want to miss the person. The person is there, lying there in front of us, and is hearing what we're saying about them. And so we want them to not to be harmed even more by our words. So we are told that in a eulogy, or in a shiva house. Where in a shiva house the soul goes back and forth between the shiva house and the grave, the things we say about the deceased, be careful what you say, because they may well be listening, so be careful about that, because you don't want to harm them, you don't want to hurt them, we don't want to hurt each other, right? We want to be kind to each other, so be careful what you say. So here's the brothers, making a story with the goal of peace in mind. They don't want Joseph to do anything, so our father told us that you should do that, even though he didn't. So Joseph says, I don't know if he actually says I forgive you. I think he says. He says I do forgive you. So here's what the brothers say to Joseph: kindly forgive the spiteful deed of your brothers and their sin, for they have done you evil. That's the first time they ask for forgiveness. So now please forgive the spiteful deed of the servants of your father's God. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And Joseph says, fear not, for am I instead of God? Although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, in order to accomplish it as clear as this day that a vast people be kept alive. So now fear not, I will sustain you and your young ones. And thus he comforted them and spoke to their heart. Right? So we're at the end of this week's Torah portion. We are all good, right? So Joseph is saying, yes, you intended evil on me. I forgive you. I don't harbor any bad feelings towards you. It was all God's plan. I see God in all of the way that it unfolded. I look back on the past and I see God in the story. You may be the tool and you have to deal with that, but I'm not holding it against you, says Joseph. That's a very high level to get to, but it's a level to pay attention to. The brothers come and they're remorseful. Please forgive us. We're different people now. We have done teshuvah. We have repented. We know this was wrong, and we want peace with you. And this is the end of this week's Torah portions. The end of the book of Genesis. And at the end, we have a family united. We have a family that's together. A family that is going to look after each other, and a family that's ready to go now into the book of Exodus, where we're going to start the descent into the slavery, and we'll talk about it next week, of what happens as they become enslaved in the land of Egypt. So let's see if I said everything I wanted to say. So what we have is this beautiful beginning to the story where Jacob understands that he needs sickness in his life to give him a warning that he's going to die, so that he can place everything in order. He can say goodbye to his children. He can bless them. He can tell them, his last will and testament, so to speak. He can have it all kind of like organized, so that when his feet are gathered and he does die, that he's at peace with that he's put his affairs in order. He blesses all of his children, and he blesses his grandchildren. This is a beautiful scene of grandparents to grandchildren. And in our day and age, there's a lot written now about how important grandparents are to their grandchildren's life. Like the love that a grandparent has to a grandchild is a different kind of love than a parent has to a child. The relationship that I have with my grandparents is different than the relationship I had with my parents, right? So what that relationship is and how valuable that can be, how much grandparents can impart, how much they love and accept, and have a different, maybe a different type of love towards their grandchildren than they do to their own children. So that's a point of conversation to be discussed. And that these two boys, his grandsons, who he blesses as if they are his own children, Ephraim and Manasseh, become the epitome of sibling love. No rivalry, no jealousy, no hatred. And the blessing is that we should be like fish that are abundant on the land, that we should be like fish who swim in waters of wisdom and Torah and spirituality, but live in the land, and we're physical and we're part of the world around us, so we're able to do both. But we're going to proliferate abundantly as fish in the land. We're going to be very cognizant of our families and how important families are as a breeding ground, or as a classroom for self-development in my relationships with my family members, with my brothers and with my parents and with our sisters and with our etc., 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 whatever family dynamic you have. That's the training ground for us learning how to be good people, and how to, the Rabbi Sachs says, the family is an area in which conflicts occur and must be managed. People within families love and quarrel. They share and they, I can't read my writing, they share and something. They please and disappoint. Families are the world in which we shape and manage our emotions. So families, even if they're annoying, even if they're difficult, even if they're all these other things, they're also beautiful and they're loving, and we have to work at them like any relationship. But this family is the arena. This is the power of the family. And Genesis is the story of the family. And the end of the family story is coming together and love and unity. And we're going to see where it's going to go from there. So, and then just to mention the idea of giving a blessing and how important it is to bless and be blessed, and to receive the blessing of others. And when we receive a blessing from others, to say, Amen, I agree, that's a good blessing, I want that to come true, and I'll give you a blessing back. So I haven't seen that yet, where you bless a child on Friday night, or you get blessed and then you turn around and you bless your parent back, or you bless other people at the table. But maybe we could start something new there, where not only are children being blessed, but we could bless each other. There's no limit to the amount of good that we would want to bestow and have others have in the world. And then, so finally, the last point is this idea of no, I don't remember what I was going to say. Sorry. Okay, so let's bless each other. Let's try to live in as much harmony as we can. Let's choose peace over truth. Let's not always be right. Let's be more peaceful than right. So my blessing to all of us is that we can get in touch with who we are, each one of us. Just like Jacob, when he blessed his children, he like, here's your strength, and here's your strength, here's your strength. So like, use them well. May we all figure out who we are, not need the approval of the outside world, to get in touch with ourselves, to know who we are, and then to take that and to be the best we can be. And I hope that we are all the best that we can be.